Hello again, and welcome to a second lecture about image and poetry. So first, let's describe or sort of hone in on what poetry is. Poetry is a compressed form of literature that mainly uses form, sound, and image to convey a story, an emotion, or an experience. Um, Poetry is often thought of as a place where you're able to be experimental, and so you might think of poets who play around with how many words are in a line. So maybe they'll just have one word. Maybe they'll sort of create shapes using words, right? Um, Poetry is often also considered fragmented, which means we don't necessarily think we need a beginning, middle, and end. But I'd like to urge you to consider that fiction and plays can also be experimental and also can be fragmented. However, this is primarily the way that we think about poetry, but I think that that's changed or will change the more experimental story writers get and playwrights get. But in any case, as a poet, because that's the next thing you're going to be writing is a poem, you want to really consider using sound, image, and form. We're going to talk about all three. Just as a heads up, we're probably going to mostly focus on image, a little bit of sound, and not enough of form. However, there are tons of videos out there that I can link you to that talk about form. When I say form, I'm really talking about the structure or the layout of a poem. This is also something that you learn more about when you take the advanced poetry class, which is why I'm not spending too much time on it for this class. And this is also a great resource where the author actually looks at the value of poetry and poetry's relationship to objects. So I've also linked you to that in case you're interested. And then I also wanted to just let you know every semester I change how I teach this course. Last semester I taught poetry using diss tracks because I do want you to remember that all of these genres of creative writing that we're talking about, there's no fixed boundaries. So there are things that can be considered poetry that maybe folks don't wouldn't guess could be considered poetry, and I think diss tracks are one of them. So in previous semesters we looked at tracks written by Biggie and Tupac that were directed at each other, and how diss tracks are also a compressed form of literature, and in there the sound and the images are really used to convey anger and aggression, and also used to beat one another, right? So there's this idea with diss tracks that you have to best the other person. The other kind of poetry that I've taught in previous semesters is protest poetry. That is where you are a speaker or you are objecting to something, whether it's a policy, a movement, a president, and the whole poem is a way to protest whatever that thing is. This semester, I'm not really focusing on like a specific genre of poetry, though I think that both Oliviera and Betts are interested in race. That's just a thematic connection that has nothing to do with like the genre of poetry. But I still wanted you to know that those are some genres that you might consider doing more research on, or just experimenting and writing within for your poetry submission. So, image. Image is a poem's pulse. If I'm not able to draw, or at least try to draw, 75% of your poem, then it's not, your poem's not using image. And so this is an example from an T.S. Eliot poem, Alfred Prufrock. And so the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes. So here you have the image of fog rubbing its back on windows. The yellow the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window pane. So again, the idea of smoke rubbing its snout on the window. Licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. So now all of a sudden you picture the evening as having corners, or maybe even being a square. You also think of the smoke as having a tongue. Lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So this is just an example of how often when I talk about how a poem has to have image, some students will say, well, my poem is not about anything that can be visualized. It's about, maybe it's about revenge. And my response to that is, if your poem is something that can't be visualized, then it simply should not be a poem. And that may be tough criticism or a tough response, but that's the response that I really believe. And so you really want to think about images that you'll develop in your poem. And here's something that you might want to respond to as a comment down below. What's an image that you can come up with for love? And I say love because love tends to be the most popular subject for creative writers. And I just recently finished watching a Netflix show called Soundtrack, in which the main character says every song, every poem is about love. And so it makes sense that that would be a very popular topic, but because it's a popular topic, you also have to realize that you need to be very specific when you talk about love, because there's so many competing poems that are talking about the same thing. So again, what's an image for love that you can come up with? Now back to what I was talking about before, the image. How do you create an image, right? That's a fair question. The first way you can create an image is by utilizing the 5 senses. So you can talk about how something looks, what does it smell like, what does it taste like, what does it feel like, what does it sound like. So you'll notice T.S. Eliot does that, right? The rubbing its back upon the window panes, that's telling us how something feels. The licking its tongue, that's kind of talking about taste. So there are examples of this in Prufrock, and then there are also examples of this in the 2 poems, or the several poems that you read for this unit. So that's one way in which you can develop an image. The other way is by using certain literary or figurative devices. One such device is personification, but I guess before I talk about that, I want you to remember that an image, when you're developing an image, you're also developing a perspective. The way a speaker describes something, right? The way a speaker describes how something looks or how something smells also tells us a lot about the speaker's perspective. It tells us about who the speaker is, how they look at the world, right? And so you want to just think about that, because if you're developing a perspective, you want to develop a perspective that's kind of consistent. So if you have, for example, a poem in which a character talks about how love looks like 3 children playing Ring Around the Rosie, and then 6 lines later, the same speaker talks about how love smells like dog shit, there's some inconsistency there that might not work. Now, it's fair to say that maybe something happened to that speaker that caused that jump in perspective, but you would need to show how that change happened. Okay, so examples of literary devices that you can use that can help you develop image. One is personification. Personification is where you give human-like characteristics to things that we don't consider human or to inanimate objects. So if you remember again with Prufrock, he's giving Fog human-like characteristics. He's giving Fog a back, and so in that way he's using personification. Here I have a picture of Magic Carpet from Aladdin. A carpet is an inanimate object, but if you remember Aladdin or if you've watched Aladdin, this magic carpet has human-like characteristics. He's able to emote through the tassels of his carpet. He's also able to show emotion. We're clearly understanding when he's sad or when he's happy. So that's personification. Why would we use personification? Well, if we think about the basic premise of this whole lecture, one reason is to help us develop an image, right? So fog is not something that we necessarily can see, but fog that's rubbing its back against a window, now all of a sudden I have an image that I'm working with. So that's one reason. The other reason for personification specifically is it can help generate an emotional connection to an object. So here, for example, if you were like me, like I really felt connected and bonded to the magic carpet, and I was sad. Uh-oh, what did I do? I was sad when the magic carpet for like a moment was not on good terms with Aladdin. Another example, if you're familiar with Castaway, Castaway is about this character who's stranded on an island, and he becomes he I guess finds a volleyball that has Wilson, which is the brand of volleyball, and becomes really attached to it. And because he becomes really attached to it, he talks to it. And so then the audience also becomes attached to it. And so then there's this moment where Wilson, I forget how, but gets lost in the ocean, and he's yelling out Wilson. And for many people who watched the movie, they also cried when Tom Hanks' character lost the volleyball. And so the idea there is, why would we cry over a volleyball? Well, because the movie personifies this volleyball and gives it human-like characteristics so that we are emotionally invested, emotionally attached to this object. Oops, I'm sorry. The other two figurative elements that you can use, metaphor and simile. These two are very popular. Metaphor is when you are saying one thing is another thing. So comparing a person to a firework, right? This comparison is saying this person is a firework. And if you think about that, the idea of a metaphor is by comparing two things, you're illustrating or you're helping us create an image of something. So if you're saying someone's a firework, then I think of this someone as maybe colorful or loud or I don't know, what else do we think of when we think of fireworks? Explosive, right? A simile is when you're comparing two things, but you're using like or as. So the example would be, baby, you're as loud as a firework, right? That would be a simile. Feel free to think of your own similes. This might also, or metaphors, this might also be a great way to go back to that question I had earlier about images for love, right? Love is, and then that could be a metaphor. Love is an empty suitcase. That's a metaphor. Love is like traveling with an empty suitcase. That's a simile. Some people say the difference between a metaphor and a simile is more specific because you're saying that um, love is like traveling with a empty suitcase, and a metaphor is just more like general. Love is an empty suitcase. I think that both kind of do the same thing. I'm more of a fan of metaphors in poetry and similes in short stories, but that's totally my preference. So that's something you'll figure out as well. These are some other devices that poets, short story writers, playwrights can use. One is extended metaphor. That's where an entire section of your poem or maybe the entire poem is linking two visual concrete ideas together, or one concrete idea to an abstract idea. Um, the key here is you're never linking two abstract ideas. And when I say abstract, I just mean something that I can't picture. So, love, death, revenge, beauty, those are all abstract ideas. So, you can, for example, you can't really use the metaphor that says love is beauty, right? Those are two abstract ideas. Love is an empty suitcase, right? And then the whole poem goes on to describe how love is an empty suitcase. Love is an empty suitcase, um, a suitcase with no lock, uh, a suitcase that has no value, right? And it's just me going on and on exploring the connection between love and this empty suitcase. That would be an extended metaphor. That's also a really cool thing to consider doing for your poetry assignment. Puns are when you play on two meanings of the same word. So this is from um, J. Cole songs. And girl, I ain't got no money to borrow, but I'm trying to find a way to get you alone. So here, alone means alone, like by yourself. But if you follow this whole line, alone can also mean alone, as in ALOAN, a loan from a bank. Now you get to watch her leave out the window. Guess that's why they call it window pane. So pane is here being used as, sort of the border of the window, but you could also hear it as pain, as in pain of looking at someone leave you or watching someone go away. So, what's the value of puns in poetry? I think as a sound effect, it's cool because we sort of hear it, and then there's a added um, effect of realizing you could hear it in two different ways. So there's that. I think more often than not, puns for me here become especially useful when thinking about diss tracks. Puns are a way to sort of show the other person or the listener how clever or how gifted or skilled you are with wordplay. Oxymorons, when you put two unlike things together, the most popular and cliched example, jumbo shrimp. C.S. Lewis has a beautiful quote: someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. The idea of putting old and fairy tales together is odd because we often think of fairy tales with youth or being a child. The usefulness of oxymorons is it can help avoid cliches. Cliches are things that are so overdone that they no longer create an image. So, for example, love is like a rose, right? That's something we've heard so often that it's become a cliche. Now, if you were to say, maybe love is like a rose that's been stomped on by a horse, that might feel a little bit like an oxymoron and a simile, in that it feels like two very unlike things, love and a rose that's been stomped on. We're not used to thinking of it in that way. Um, Conceit is very similar to an extended metaphor. It's when you have a poem where the whole basis of the poem is comparing two things that are not similar, that are unlike. each other. The difference between conceit and extended metaphor is conceit is where the whole poem is doing this. Extended metaphor can just be a section of a poem. Connotation and denotation. So denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. Connotation is the idea of the word, the way that we use it, maybe in um, contemporary times. So, for instance, if you're using the word bitch, yes, the denotation of that word is female dog, but there is another connotation to that word. So, that's another way that you can develop maybe not an image, but develop a perspective of a speaker. These are other ways to develop your poetry, your image in a poem, allusions when you're referring to another work, another piece of art. Paradox is something that seems to be false, but when you actually think about it, it contains an element of truth. Hyperbole is where you're over exaggerating. So I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. There's also something, I didn't write this down, but there's something where you are actually underplaying something. So there's a poem in which someone cuts her finger off and she describes it as though it's just like a routine or like a normal part of her day. And so that the function of that is to sort of make us feel I mean, I guess terrified, but also to show us the perspective of this speaker who describes losing a finger as something no more terrifying than breaking a fingernail. These are some things you want to avoid. Again, dead metaphors, things that have been compared so much that the image just doesn't come up for readers. Cliches, these are images or phrases that have been done so much that it's just not original anymore, so avoid those. You want to try to avoid adverbs as much as possible. Adverbs are the words that modify verbs. So he screamed loudly. Loudly would be an adverb. The reason why you want to avoid adverbs is they tend to show that you're not picking strong enough verbs. So instead of saying he screamed loudly, you could just say he screeched, right? Um, Adjectives are useful, but you just want to make sure you're not overusing them where we have no sense of like concrete things. Um, so, like the red, gorgeous, wonderful, beautiful girl. All of those things, with the exception of red, aren't really helping me develop an image. And so they're not really useful or impactful for the poem. Again, you also want to avoid abstractions. This goes back to the rule of showing and not telling. You don't want to tell us this poem is about love or tell us this poem is about beauty. You want to show us through concrete images. These are some important things about sound. Again, poetry, if you remember, like I said before, pays particular attention to sound because poems are meant to be read out loud. I don't know if any of you read the poems for this unit out loud, but there's a different kind of experience. And so these are just three, I think, really important things you can do with sound. Assonance is where you have matching vowel sounds in the ending word. So I am not Jasmine, I am Aladdin. The I is a vowel sound that comes at the end of Jasmine and Aladdin. Alliteration, beginning consonants repeat. Dungeon, dragon. Consonants, repeating ending consonants. A little drop of candy paint drips, so drop the P. Why do this? Well, certain sounds and repeating of sounds elicit an emotion, create an experience, create a feeling. So when you overuse the D sound, that can help create this feeling of dread and doom. when you overuse the P sound, that could help create this experience of whimsy, of maybe even innocence. So that's one reason why you might think about playing around with sound. These are just ways you can rhyme. I would just be careful of, so true rhyme is when the whole word rhymes with the other word. So like cat, hat, right? That's a true rhyme. Um, it's a rhyme that's clearly heard and clearly seen. Internal rhyme or slant rhyme is where it it does have similar sounds, but it's not a complete rhyme. So like mind and shine, that doesn't look to be a rhyme, but it does sound very similar. I would be careful of true rhymes. It can, if not used correctly, make your poem sound a little Dr. Seussish, especially if there are rhymes with words that we expect someone to use, like cat and hat would be one of them. Love and dove would be another, right? And that goes back to like cliches. If you're using rhymes that we've heard over and over, they can actually make your poem kind of cheesy. So just be mindful of that. And very briefly on form. Form in poetry considers a couple of things. Are you going to have short lines? If you have short lines, after every line, you imagine your reader would stop for a second, take a breath, and then move on to the next line. Do you want your reader to have that experience? Or would you prefer long lines where the reader sort of has to go through a whole line that might take a couple of minutes and then stop and then move on to the next line? The other thing to consider is enjambment. Enjambment is the idea that you can start a sentence in the middle of a poetic line. Um, Punctuation. Are you going to have periods at the end of your poetic line? Or are you going to have no periods whatsoever? Or are you going to use commas? Capitalization. Are you going to capitalize every first letter of every line? Or are you going to have no capital letters? That's something that's up to you. And you want to be mindful and intentional of these decisions. And then I just briefly wanted to talk about the speaker of your poem. The speaker of your poem isn't you, right? The speaker of your poem is someone that it could have similar characteristics to you, but more than often it's someone that you've created, someone that you've imagined, right? And so for that reason, it's important that you think about what is your speaker's voice. Voice contains three things: diction. Diction means what are the words that my speaker uses. Diction would also be where you think about sound, right? Like, does my speaker rhyme? Does my speaker use a lot of alliteration? Does my speaker use a lot of consonants? Rhythm. So, does my speaker use long lines, short lines? Does my speaker start sentences in the middle of lines? And perspective. And perspective, if you remember, goes back to image, right? How does my speaker see things? How does my speaker hear things? How does my speaker feel things? And so this is an example from a show that might be actually really outdated now, but I think of it as a really good example of voice, and that's Girls. So in the series, we have a 25-year-old Hannah who uses her voice a lot, or tries to use her voice a lot, to depict female empowerment. And so if we break it down with those three things that I mentioned here, her word choice, she's constantly using a lot of I and we and us. Her rhythm, she is very long-winded. Her sentences are very long. And her perspective, the way she sees the world, this is a specific example. She goes to a workshop and she submits a story, and another person doesn't like Hannah's story. And so Hannah understands that as, well, that person must have suffered domestic violence issues, and that's why she can't handle my story. And so that sort of helps us understand that Hannah is a very I'm gonna. She's a self-centered character, and she's also a little delusional. Rather than seeing this person who doesn't like her story as someone who might be able to offer her valuable feedback, Hannah immediately sees her as someone who has problems of her own and is just unable to understand how great Hannah's story is. Um, so that's an example of how voice can really help you develop a very interesting character, which is something we'll talk more about when we're talking about stories. Here is a Langston Hughes poem, which I think also shows the value of voice in uh, poetry. I'll leave it up here so that you can. Oh, and I don't know why this 9 is here. It shouldn't be here. So that you can read it on your own. And just if you'd like, as a comment, to talk about how voice is being used here. What are some of the word choices that this speaker uses? How would you categorize the rhythm? How would you categorize the perspective? And just so you understand here, um, when I say lines, this is a short line, right? And then notice here it becomes a little longer, and then notice here this is a one-word poetic line. Also notice that not every sentence has a punctuation mark. So these are all choices that you want to make. As a recap, poetry is condensed kind of literature meant to be spoken out loud that considers image, sound, and form. Image is to create an image, you think about sensory details, right? The 5 senses. You can also create an image by using figurative language like personification, metaphor, simile, etc. And voice, the voice of the speaker, means that you're thinking about diction, rhythm, and perspective. Diction is word choice. Rhythm is has to do with like the lines of a poem, and perspective has to do with image, right? How the speaker sees, feels, hears the world or whatever event you're talking about or idea you're talking about in the poem. And that's that. I look forward to talking to you next time.